somewhere between 60 and 70% of ship owners say they go above baseline compliance. However, only 27% of charterers offer better terms to those ship owners that exceed their ESG baseline. Hello, everyone, and hello, Raal. Welcome to Undocked. Good to see you, Raal. How are you?
I'm fantastic, Nick. Good to see you as well. And you're beaming in live from Dubai, is that right?
I am. Yeah, I'm at a container shipping conference, and I can show you that I've got what I think are possibly the best conference takeaways I've ever seen. Look at these little containers. Sorry if anyone's listening to this. They've got they're 3D printed containers, and every shipping company and every terminal that came along got their own container. So I've got PIL ones, I've got CMA CGM, and we've all been swapping.
Yeah.
Which ones did you get? Which everyone's trying to build out a collection. So everyone in the breaks, everyone's been swapping containers, which has been great fun.
I love toys.
Yeah.
I was responsible for events until quite recently, last job. And I've sort of railed against landfill. I wouldn't allow people to get landfill giveaways. I presume they have no useful purpose.
Absolutely none. But I can assure you, they will not be going to landfill. These are going to take pride of place on my desk.
Well, exactly.
For years to come.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of objet d'art. Or as I learned from a friend of mine, a great Polish word, chuczki.
What's that mean?
There's like little bits, little bits
that have
no useful purpose that you put on the mantelpiece on the shelf.
Whatever. Oh, I'm a chuczki collector in that case.
Yeah, little sort of horse brasses, that kind of thing. Small, tiny thimbles and things like that. Anyway, well, that sounds fun. How is it? It's good?
It's good. Yeah, I mean, it's good, but I have been here since Monday night, and it's now Wednesday afternoon that we're recording this, and I am yet to go outdoors. Part of the reason I haven't left the building is because I've just come off a Thetius webinar that I was hosting. We've just launched some research with Rightship this morning, and I think you'll find the results interesting. So let me give you some stats, and I'll get your live reaction, because the report is literally just, I think in the next 20 minutes it goes out on a general release to the public. So you're getting a 20-minute advanced preview. You lucky thing.
You're very good to me.
We had a theory that ship owners who invest significant amounts in ESG don't get rewarded in the market for it by charterers. So in a tight market, low vessel availability, the charterer will just take what's available to them, and they won't pay a premium for ships that invest heavily in crew safety, crew welfare, environmental issues, good governance at the kind of ship owning level. So we did a survey where we asked ship owners whether they invest above baseline and B, whether they feel rewarded for it. And then we asked charterers whether they look for ship owners who invest above baseline and whether they structure that into any of their chartering agreements. And we thought there would be a small gap in the results. And we were slightly worried that, there just wouldn't be anything statistically significant, and we would have struggled to actually put something meaningful together. But let me give you these stats.
Today's episode is brought to you by Sedna. Many technology platforms in trade push companies into closed systems, dictating how work gets done and limiting the tools you can use. The result? Less flexibility, slower innovation, and workflows shaped by the vendor instead of the business. Sedna takes a different approach. With Sedna Connect, organizations have the freedom to integrate the systems they already rely on or build their own custom solutions through an open API. One platform, one version, endless flexibility. Sedna doesn't force lock-in. Instead, it empowers businesses, developers, and partners to shape workflows their own way. With Sedna, control stays where it belongs, with the customer. Explore Sedna Connect at sedna.com.
So, based on the survey and interviews we did, 73% of ship owners who responded to us told us that they go above baseline compliance in safety. 60% of them told us they go above baseline compliance and sustainability, and 67% in crew welfare. So somewhere between 60 and 70% of ship owners say they go above baseline compliance. However, only 27% of charterers offer better terms to those ship owners that exceed their ESG baseline. So 2/3 of ship owners say they go above the absolute minimum standard, but only 1/3 of charterers actually say that they will pay more for it.
Yeah. Well, the big shock there is that the received wisdom around why people go above the baseline is because they want to please the charterers. And I
That's what everyone
myself,
says.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I myself have certainly pontificated that, that charterers are probably doing as much to, or customers, let's just say, maybe charterers is not broad enough, but are the ones that are actually pushing standards higher up than the regulator. That's been my perception. Obviously, not based on conversations that I've had with relevant people. That's not something that
Yeah.
I've dreamed up on my own. So that's quite staggering.
Big difference, right?
Yeah, could we just rewind slightly before we get into this? Because I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, Rightship to a certain extent they certainly represent charterers' interests, right? That's and they have on their board, their ownership is in part by charter interest. So what was their reason for commissioning the research?
I think in part they felt there was a gap as well. And, we've been doing crew welfare related research since we started, go all the way back to 2019.
Yeah.
And the result has always been, hit the ship owner over the head. You're not doing enough, ship owner. You need to do more for crew welfare. These are the things you need to do. And I feel like we've never actually taken, speaking as Thetius here, a kind of system-wide approach that said, well, actually, can the ship owners, do they have room to maneuver and do they have room to invest? And if they do, does it actually make commercial sense for them? Or are they just doing it because it's the right thing to do? And it's always been a kind of hunch, that maybe charterers could do more. And I think probably the charterers that sit on the board of Rightship and sort of make up the cap table are probably kind of will be within that 27% on that kind of leading edge. And certainly we had the head of HSEQ for BHP on the webinar we just ran, and he was talking about the kind of BHP perspective, and it certainly sounds like they're in that category of charterers that really do try to unearth who's good and who's bad, although they have issues actually getting access to the information as well, which I think is partly where Rightship comes in. But I think what the survey said to us, and bear in mind our surveys will be relatively self-selecting to the more proactive end of the market because they're actually engaging in Thetius research. What our survey says is actually that, which is done anonymously, if you go slightly wider, the kind of wider chartering market just does not reward, or is not capable of rewarding the ship owners who kind of go above and beyond. So what we're trying to do really with the report is, yes, ship owners could always do more, always, but it's not just down to the ship owners. Actually, This is a much wider systemic issue. And at the moment, those ship owners who do more, generally speaking, are doing it because it's the right thing to do, not because it makes solid commercial sense, that they can build a real solid business case that if I invest X in the ship here or X in the crew, I get Y in my chartering rates. It just doesn't come to fruition.
Yeah. Obvious question or obvious thing to point out is that sort of, chartering, there's a broad church, right? In terms of, there's a big difference between people who are trying to win Amazon's business, IKEA's business, those kind of very consumer focused, very visible brands, let's say, versus kind of iron ore or kind of bigger commodity. So for example, when we look to the oil and the gas sectors, they are very, very risk averse. They are very, very much interested in going above and beyond as far as compliance goes, principally because of some of those very public, Exxon Valdez as an example, very public incidents, which seeing seabirds covered in oil and seeing it on the coast, on the beach, is very emotive for the general public. And did you sort of segregate those samples in any way in terms of sector specific?
We didn't segment the survey results, but what we did do is do some analysis on port state control issues, and particularly around detentions and around fatality rates on various vessel types. In the dry bulk market, port state control detentions are 4 times higher than the tanker market, and fatality rates are also much higher. So there is a 0.42% fatality ratio compared to 0.14% of LNG and LPG vessels. So the data that we looked at, Rightship gave us some data which was very helpful of them. They found that in 2024, 12,540 days were lost to detention across all vessels in the market. The kind of estimated value of that charter time that's been lost is $188 million. Which is big numbers.
If you talk about big disasters or stuff like that, most people go about their lives thinking it's not going to happen to them, but actually putting in front of people what the costs of being delayed in port through detentions and deficiencies is perhaps much easier for them to connect to and to see.
To a financial outcome.
Yeah. What you said there is very interesting as well about the different sectors and the performance there, and guess what? If you invest much, much more in those safety control systems, your safety culture, training and so forth, you are going to see that kind of marked difference. That does give me a bit of a segue. One of the things that Rightship are involved with is this dry bulk center of excellence. I'm not sure how much you know about that.
No, I've not heard of it.
So, well, this is one of the problems that they have. And this is an initiative between Intercargo and Rightship to actually look to raise standards effectively. Now, one of the things that you'll see in the tanker sector is OCIMF, the trade association, which is representing the energy majors. I think they prefer to be called these days. It's a conformance rather than a compliance standard, because you're not going to be penalized by the regulators, but you will fail to win some of those bigger and juicier contracts if you don't go down the road with them. And they have their SIRE inspection process by which they kind of evaluate people, and they have a tanker management self-assessment. There's different levels of maturity within it, but they are effectively prescribing the kinds of things that they want to see an organization be on top of. And that will be in part down to the way things are managed from the shore perspective and also from the vessel perspective. And so the Dry Bulk Center of Excellence in setting up, what's it called, Dry BMS, this is an attempt to set the same agenda for the dry bulk market. And they have put together the same kind of tooling, the same kind of program, which has, I think they split it over people, plant and process. So 3 different areas that they're looking at, and sort of checklists that companies can go through and look at how they're performing against the agreed expectation, which has been set by the DBCE, Dry Bulk Center of Excellence, the working group of their stakeholders who have put the Dry BMS standard together. The thing about that is that there are 2 customers for that, essentially, in terms of people setting up to it. One is the ship operator, so the manager or the owner that's actually managing the vessel, but also the charterer, who would want to be able to get access to that system in much the same way that they get access to the kind of information and dashboards that Rightship provide. But this is something that's a little bit more about how is actually the management sort of going on, and how does that look? What things are they doing to manage their vessels and their procedures and so on board? So yeah, and the battle there is obviously one of awareness. You hadn't heard of it, and it was brought up actually when I was in Cyprus as well. It's been around for a little while, but it's looking to get that adoption. It's an initiative that I'm keen to sort of promote, and I'm interested from what Rightship is saying there with the data that they've done in this report with you, perhaps helps to inform initiatives like that and how you then go about and engage with charterers on it. I'm keen to understand, obviously, I know your reports very well. You present the data, but you also present a sort of a hypothesis, or normally there's kind of like some sort of takeaway or call to arms, let's say. What is would you be able to share with us where you go with this report? What's the outcomes that you're looking for?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the recommendations. Actually, but before I do though, I'll just some stats that back up what you're saying. And actually your point on the fact that program exists, I think, is a really positive thing. One of the big things that came out of the report and out of the discussion that I was just involved with was like the fragmentation that exists across the industry and the lack of a common standard for this stuff outside of the tanker market is a big driver of the issue. And exactly as you say, like everyone wants to be able to invest in this stuff, but actually being able to, like, physically knowing, whether a vessel is looking after their crew or not is really difficult. And in some of the interviews that we did, it was a conversation from charterers saying at any one time they'll have 200 ships on charter and they never have contact with the end owner. It'll be coming from a commercial operator, and so they're one step removed from the owner of the ship. And one stat from the report that I found quite mind-blowing is that only 7% of charterers that responded to us have any kind of mechanism in place to assess crew welfare during contract negotiations. So it's a near enough 1 in 20 has any kind of mechanism where they can actually assess crew welfare before they fix a vessel. So, the mechanisms just don't necessarily exist, even though the will is there. But in terms of what, oh, go on, go on.
Just as an aside, just because I don't, well, we do want people writing in, but they might write in on this one.
Yeah, right.
I also know that the Rightship platform does actually have within it a partners program. Essentially, it's a sort of a badge of solutions that they think are contributive to seafarers' safety and well-being. So if you were the charterer and you're perusing your vessels, you can at least see, I take your point. It's a pretty loose metric, but it is an indication, and perhaps that's why Rightship are, looking and we'll look to progress that sort of a bit further. But yeah, just an aside, they do have something on there.
Yes, no, you are right. The mechanisms do exist, but it certainly appears from what we, from the responses that the uptake and active use of those mechanisms is still quite low. But that was one of our kind of core recommendations to industry. So you're right, we always do recommendations to industry at the end of our reports. One of them was actually to define and then standardize expectations of what good looks like, quote unquote, that gets recognized across all vessel types. And we know that this has worked in the tanker market. We know tankers are operated more safely. We know that if you're reporting into OCIMF and you get a bad SIRE report, that you're less likely to be chartered. So we know that as a mechanism does work, and it has raised the standard. Rolling out a version of that across the rest of the industry would be really powerful. The other recommendations were to reward owners sort of who are taking the lead on ESG through financial incentives. So long-term contracts, but also kind of looking at the wider set of industry stakeholders, port fee discounts, sustainability linked loans, that sort of stuff. Making ESG transparent and comparable through decision grade data platforms. Again, like Rightship are a good example of this. There are other platforms on the market as well that do this sort of stuff, but bringing everyone to a single standard where you get the right information about the ship at the right time when you're evaluating your options. And then actually elevating recognitions, reputation and financial value actually flows to like those who really lead in this space. Because at the moment, we don't really have any way of formally recognizing those who really truly invest in this stuff. So to creating some kind of mechanism that allows for that would help, in our opinion.
I should have also mentioned in the previous point I made there, of course, Rightship also they have a self-assessment, thing around mental health and well-being, which is also, I think available in the platform. It's dealt with to a certain extent in port state control. One of the things that comes up quite heavily in deficiencies and detentions is the things relating to MLC. This is the Maritime Labour Convention. So this is not an IMO convention. It's the International Labour Organization. And that will include things like, there are obligations there in terms of what you do in terms of the food that you provide, for example, and hours of work and rest and all these sort of other things as well. So yeah, but they're all in sort of slightly different places. And there are other initiatives that people sign up to. So one of them could be the intermanager principles, for example. We vice president of intermanager. Within that, we have an evaluation there, which takes in parts of that. So it's very bitty, and it is probably quite difficult for someone, particularly if they're not embedded in the industry, to really understand what those metrics are. So I think having a common standard is very, 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 very helpful. The other thing is, the second point I would make is that I've mentioned it before. If we can start to connect where seafarers are in terms of their training and their welfare and those kind of very human factors directly to the KPIs that the charterers really do care about, then I think we are able to move the dial much more successfully. Because I think that linking human performance, vessel performance, and ultimately the commercial performance of the vessel, I think that is kind of something that is the most likely to really drive change. And I don't think anybody's doing enough on that. As we get more data, as you get more connectivity, I think it is something that will come to the fore. Because there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that humans are such an important part of the industry that, ensuring that they're able to work to their best, and that does involve their welfare and their happiness. There's no doubt about that in my mind. That will probably drive change.
I think my slightly cynical, pessimistic view on this whole thing is that what I think the research demonstrates is that in a tight market where you've got a deadline, you've got cargo that needs to move and low availability of ships, whatever's available will be chartered to a baseline standard. And so it's not a case of better ships get a higher rate. It's a case of ships that fall below the baseline standard just don't get chartered, which obviously we have in the tanker market. And I think potentially then the question becomes then how do you over time make sure that baseline standard is always being ratcheted up, and that we over time kind of take out those operators who are just fall so far down below the line. And the other thing which we don't address in the research, this is more just kind of thinking off the top of my head, is what we do about the kind of bottom 10% of operators, who are proactively, through omission or commission, proactively violating the rights of seafarers. And are there mechanisms in the market that become punitive for those kind of operators? I had a kind of LinkedIn conversation back and forth with David Hammond, who's the CEO of Human Rights at Sea, who's kind of the charity founded on the kind of tenet that everyone, wherever you are, whether you're at sea or on land, has the same set of human rights. And he was suggesting criminal liability for directors of companies that abuse the rights of seafarers. And I can absolutely see where he's coming from, because at the moment there isn't really a mechanism. If you abandon a ship, there isn't really a mechanism wherever you are in the world. There's lots of ways that you can get away with it in terms of
Sorry, just clarify what you mean by abandoned ship. You don't mean jumping off the side of the ship.
Yeah, sorry. One of the biggest issues that faces the industry today for crew, there's probably two issues I would say for seafarers that are, the absolute worst things that could happen. One is criminalization. You are, as an officer on the ship, you are potentially criminally liable if something goes wrong. And it's quite common that masters and chief mates get arrested. Relatively common around the world that there are miscarriages of justice and all that sort of stuff when it comes to ship's officers. So that's one thing. But the second is being abandoned by the ship's owner. So it shouldn't happen, and it isn't legally allowed to happen, but it's quite possible for a ship owner who gets into some kind of financial distress. They've essentially just get to the point where they just put their hands up and walk away from the ship. They cut all comms with the vessel. The ship will be sat at anchor somewhere waiting to go into port. They will stop paying the crew. They'll stop sending food out to the ship because the ship then can't go into port, because then who's going to pay the bill for going into port? And it's quite often that crews stuck on ships that have been abandoned in the market by their owners get left on board for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and the master on board the vessel has a legal responsibility for the vessel. So it's not like they can all just get in a lifeboat and go ashore. That then gets you into the criminalization bit, because if they abandon the ship and make it unsafe for other ships in the area, it opens up a whole other load of liability. So it's a really horrible situation to find yourself in. And there are very few mechanisms, if any, really, if you're a master or chief engineer or you're just on a ship as an AB or something, if you get abandoned by your owner, you can get seriously stuck.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. Yeah. And of course, even if all those things, were not the case and they were in port and they didn't have a visa issue, there's still thousands of miles.
You're then
from
stuck.
home.
Yeah,
They've
exactly.
got to try and find the money for, and they haven't been paid. It's even on a very simple level, it's atrocious. So this is why the kind of research that you've done there is really important.
Well, thank you for plugging it for me. If you're interested in it, go to Thetius.com.
I will have a read.
It's free.
Yeah, I will have a read for sure. One of the things that caught my eye, it was actually a couple of weeks ago, but that I think it was announced on the 24th, I think. There was a very interesting acquisition that kind of went under the radar a little bit by ABS, the Classification Society. And that was their acquisition of something called MetaShip from Orca Informatics. We should say that this was not an acquisition of the company. So it's an IP acquisition, which is very unusual. I don't think we've had any of those come up, certainly since we started doing this. I don't believe we've had one of those. They are interesting, I think. I'd like to see more of them because they make a lot of sense. They are very difficult.
Yeah.
They're very difficult to do. For a trade sale is obviously a bit easier, which is what this is. The founder of Orca Informatics is a guy called Levent Sen, who's from ex-mariner from Turkey. And he and I became friends some years ago. This is the early days of sort of VR in shipping. And there was a small little group of us at the time that were that were working on this. And so we became friends, and I took an interest in what he was doing with the MetaShip. And what he's done with the MetaShip is essentially it's a platform which is using game technology to be able to have an immersive training environment on board a ship. So what's the experience like? If you imagine, I think a lot of people are familiar with computer gaming. So it's first person view. So you're looking through your eyes and you are literally going to the ship, walking up the gangway, interact with different characters. And within that, that's where your different training scenarios can happen, which are teaching you, procedural things, how equipment works, could be any of the kind of things that you might want to wrap a lesson in. And he's built up this kind of world. So from a number of sort of little independent missions, and I believe he's got different sort of ship types covered. So there'll be, things that are relevant to different trades, and those can be covered there as well. So ABS have picked this up. They've also picked up a couple of other things as well within it. There's something called Odin-S, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is basically for tracking training and having more traditional e-learning content in there. And then something called NSBA, which is navigational skill and behavioral assessment. So simulation-based, designed to evaluate and enhance skills maritime personnel. So three things in there. And I think from a strategic point of view, I think a lot of the classification societies are looking at the challenges that are coming with the energy transition and also digitization more broadly, and lots of tech coming in, looking at things like the report. The DNV, of course, were involved in the report that was as part of the Just Transitions task force work. 300,000 seafarers are needing skills training by 2030, I think it is. So yes, not an unusual kind of move that they've done this, and it'd be interesting to see where they go with it. Of course, they've got their Wavesite platform as well. So when you look at the other elements that they've got as part of this deal, would be interesting to see whether they start to build Wavesite out into something that has a bit more of a human capital management focus as well.
Super interesting. I went on their Orca Informatics website, and I must say the graphics are stunning.
Yeah.
Like it really does look like you're on a PS4 game or something like that. Like it's really, really nicely done.
Yeah, the attention to detail is really, really good. And, the quality of what he's done. And this is the interesting thing for me, because I think, hopefully Levin won't mind me saying this. He is an innovator. He's a product guy. He's not a salesman, right? He's not a big mouth marketer like me. And when I've seen what they've done, I had a demo of it some years back, and I'm sure it's come on since then as well. It was much more worthy of attention than it actually got, in my view. And I think if you look at the website, you're not going to get it. Maybe this is interesting for people, but this is the reason that I came into Maritime, that through this sort of gaming angle. I was teaching on an MSc it was the first MSc, I think, Masters in computer games at the University of Westminster. And so when Videotel, as it was then, they were looking to make their e-learning materials more interesting, more interactive, and so forth. And so they looked to hire somebody in who could help them to do that. And I came in, and that was kind of how I got involved in all of this. So I was pushing that agenda very early on. The serious games agenda is something that I really, really believed in. Let's just maybe helpful if we just get into a couple of definitions. The first one is, people talk a lot about gamification, and gamification has been the kind of catch-all term, or gamified learning. There's an important distinction. There's two things that it really splits out as. One is what I would call serious games. And serious games is basically the point of what you're trying to do is learning, but you're utilizing computer game technology, techniques to be able to convey that learning. I'll give a bit more of an explanation of what we're talking about there. But gamification is something slightly different, because what you're really doing there is you're using game mechanics to motivate someone to do something different, usually in the real world. So if, for example, I introduce leaderboards and badges and all those kinds of things to try to motivate you, those are things that they're basically saying, when people play Space Invaders, showing my age, at the end of the game, they'll get that leaderboard and they'll see the top,
right. Yeah.
And they'll go like, oh, people play that game because they want to be on the leaderboard. So we can take a leaderboard and we can put that in, but we can make it about something else that people are doing. So, how many how quickly can they do job X, or how,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. And then that becomes a thing.
Safety KPIs. I've seen it done with safety KPIs.
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
across a
yeah.
whole fleet, everyone's got access to the safety KPIs, and there's a leaderboard what the best ship is in the fleet is, which I thought was very cool.
Exactly that. Or you can acquire badges. So a good example of that is Duolingo, right? So Duolingo is not a game. It uses gamification to motivate you to remember and to learn vocabulary, and all those mechanics are designed to motivate you. So the two things can be used together, by the way. You will see a blending of serious games and gamification, but they don't necessarily go together. And they have different kind of pros and cons, essentially. So what we're talking about with the MetaShip, for me, sits in that serious games. The key thing about it is that it gives you a lot of benefits for immersion. They're very active as well. This is how human beings essentially like to learn. We like to explore. That's how we make sense of the world around us, through that kind of play. And it's in a safe environment. So much like a simulation, you're creating a safe space for people to do that, so they can make mistakes and learn by mistakes, which is also very effective. And as I said, it's a very active way of finding your way through this. You can build sort of, if you think about, I mentioned Grand Theft Auto, if you think about games like that, there's normally a really good story to it as well, and that story helps with the immersion. If you think about a simulation, what's the problem with a simulation is very often it's very technical, unless you're kind of doing a scenario like role play scenario or whatever as part of the simulation. It can be a bit technical. And the problem with that is that you can be very sort of focused on the task and understand that you're within a simulation. When you start to employ kind of gaming techniques into that, there's a possibility to, through the story, get people feeling much more like they are actually when they're working. You can distract people, for example. You can bring in, MacGuffins that make them think, oh, this is what the task is about, that. So like I said, when we did our Enclosed Spaces game, we gave them a task, a meaningless but very complex task they had to do, where they had to kind of change this valve, I think it was, or something. And the whole point was that they started thinking that was the task they were being asked to do. Meanwhile, you then set up something where they were going to see a colleague fallen in the next room, and that was then going to be the thing that then they would react like they might in real life, and so on. So now the issues around it, and this is the kind of things I have to be really honest, despite being a big fan of this approach, is it's very expensive for quite a small. You're typically covering many fewer learning points. And there can be, there are technological barriers as well. We should be honest about that. Computers have got much better, but these are very processor intensive, and the better the graphics and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Usually browser-based struggles even now, I think. So I think MetaShip runs on so it's using internet protocols, but I think, you wouldn't run Grand Theft Auto in your browser. It would just wouldn't make sense. It's a locally run thing. So there are some technological setbacks, but the biggest one is the effort versus cost ratio. And that's why MetaShip is really interesting, because if you create a world and you create an engine and you create all those models and all of those different bits, and then you're building scenarios into that, which are utilizing all of those pre-canned things that you've got, then I think that you have a real potential, and perhaps make it much more affordable.
Do you know what I found out the other day? So my TikTok feed is just ships and planes, basically. It's very dull unless you're into it, which I am, which is good. But I was scrolling through, and this pilot came on and he was talking about simulation. The first time a pilot flies a plane for real, when they get type approved on a particular type of plane, there are passengers in the back. Like, it's a real flight. They don't do test flights when you get type rated for a new plane. So like if you work on a Airbus A300 and then you're going up to the Airbus A380, they do the whole thing in the simulator, everything, and fully sign off that person is qualified to fly the plane. And the first time that pilot will actually physically sit and fly the actual plane will be a commercial flight with 500 passengers in the back. Now there's a senior captain who's like babysitting them just to make sure they don't, completely mess up. The aviation industry certifies pilots based purely on simulation. Isn't that mad? It just completely blew my mind. Like, from a shipping perspective, it's so totally at odds with how we do things.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it is pretty mind blowing, but at the same time, I wonder how much of that is to do with how little difference the pilot really makes these days, in terms of how how little there is for them to do. Well, let me put it more kindly. If you reach the point where the simulation is so tightly mapped to the reality,
The real world.
yeah, that the instrumentation is the same, the mathematical models, the physics, everything is absolutely the same. I was privileged to sit on one of the old school simulators, didn't even use 3D graphics, used camera over this model, incredible. That was years ago. And that was with an old Vietnam War pilot. It was he had some stories, I can tell you. The thing that struck me in that was, that because the cockpit was all absolutely bona fide, it was all the same thing. And he got me to land that plane.
Yeah.
I'd never had a lesson.
Well, if you can do it, Raal.
That should give people confidence when they're sat on the...
It's easy.
I mean, it was a rough landing, don't get me wrong. We were all bouncing around a little bit, but that did make me think, wow, that's incredible. Because obviously he was sat next to me saying, right now, now pull the,
pull that bit.
Yeah, push that button. And, so maybe this is why, it's not, but it is pretty crazy.
I think it's
You're
also
right.
There is little difference. So just to clarify for everyone, they do learn to fly a plane in a real plane first. It's only once they're qualified pilots to do the type rating for the specific type of plane. And I think the other aspect of that is that there is actually, there's so little difference between one type rating and another that you can drill those differences in a simulator. But a friend of mine is a captain at BA, and he's told me that kind of when they're going through their training, like the simulation work they do is so intense. Like they crash many times in the simulator, because they are put into the worst possible conditions to test them. And so by the time something actually goes wrong in the air, like they've done it 100 times in the simulator. And I think that's another difference is 5 days of simulator training is sort of what you need in the maritime industry to qualify as an officer of the watch, and then another 5 days of simulator training as a master. Whereas these guys are doing 5 days every year, and they're doing the worst case scenarios during those 5 days as well.
Yeah, they'll take out an engine and things like that, won't they? And they
do.
But an interesting, just off the back of that, you've reminded me that I need to kind of catch up with, because that's something I was watching very closely and is an interesting debate in maritime that relates to what you were talking about there, around simulator time counting as sea time. So this is the sea time component is a perennial difficulty for people like myself who have predominantly worked in sort of digital learning or distance learning, remote learning, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to give flexibility to the pathway of how and where people can pick up skills. Now, the caveat here is there's always things that have to be done on the actual ship, right? The real ship, or there has to be. But as ships become more technology dependent, as it becomes more about pushing buttons on a panel, then it should be easier to kind of bring much more simulation to the fore. And we'll see much more of this as we get into the new fuels side of things. We need to explore and put under the microscope the things that could potentially be done through other routes, such as simulation. This led to quite fierce arguments, and I know good people on both sides, of the debate who were saying that you absolutely sacrosanct, you cannot break the sea time model.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have a dog in the fight. I think as long as we focus on outcomes. But if you look at the simulator versus the sea time, you have exactly the possibility that you mentioned there. If I have sea time as my main criteria is sea time, what's happening in that? I'm on a ship, but what's actually happening? Sea time is not equal everywhere, right? There are very, very intense waterways, Singapore Straits, English Channel, where you're going to be picking up way many more kind of skills and seamanship that test you than certain other places. And that's the potential benefit with the simulator, or putting perhaps more faith into that simulator time, that you can set up very taxing scenarios and you can throw curveballs in and stuff like that. So interesting.
I have strong opinions on this topic.
Good.
As I imagine you would imagine I do. So I think there's a few things. One is, life at sea is 99% boredom and then like 1% pure terror. And I think it's important to train in both of those things. The argument of sea time being sacrosanct. Yes, you can do a lot of the interesting scenarios and things going wrong in a simulator, and that's really important to drill that stuff. But actually, crossing an ocean is boring, and you have to do, 8, maybe 12 hours a day stood on the bridge with no traffic around you. I remember crossing the Atlantic. Besides a daily steering test where we put the rudder hard over in either direction, no one touched the controls for 3 weeks. And it's also an autonomous ship. We just had no need to touch the controls. We didn't see any other ships. We were following the course. That was it. There was nothing to do. And I actually think there is a certain mental toughness, I guess, that you have to build up that you can't substitute but in a simulator. And the ability to go from, this is quite boring, I'm, 4 months into this trip, there's nothing really going on that's simulating me, to suddenly needing to switch on and take action for something is actually a really important skill that I think is underappreciated. That said, for the 1% terabit, I think that absolutely should go in a simulator, and we should drill that stuff far more than we do. Certainly the time I spent in simulators, I never found particularly valuable, because I didn't do it to the master's level, but I was only doing off the watch stuff. We near enough just did a kind of normal, quote unquote, normal voyage with fairly normal vanilla coal rake stuff to do. I never really felt we got strongly tested in the simulators. But I think the argument about simulators for sea time is actually a massive red herring, because the reason certain bits of the industry are pushing for more simulation to cover the sea time requirement is because they can't get cadets berths on ships, which actually is just a much more systemic problem. And so people embark on a 3-year cadetship, they get 2 years and 10 months into their cadetship, and they find they've only got 9 months sea time. And they've physically, the training companies in the UK, this is a very UK centric issue, the training companies physically cannot find the berths for the cadets to go onto the ships to get the sea time. And so the kind of compromise is, well, we'll reduce your sea time requirement by 2 months if you do extra time in the simulator, which doesn't actually solve the systemic problem of there aren't enough cadet berths on ships. And therefore, perhaps the kind of follow on to that argument is, well, maybe there's just not enough demand for merchant navy officers in the UK, full stop, for the number of merchant navy officers that are coming through, which is a sad state of affairs, but it is where we're at. So I feel like everyone's got really obsessed with this question around simulation for sea time. And actually, I just don't think it addresses the fundamental issue that the kind of, in the UK at least, that we have around seafarer training. It just kind of glosses over it and is a bit of a red herring.
That cadet's berth thing, though, is not just a UK problem.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's come up a lot of time. We talk about it quite often. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an interesting one as well. When we talk about like the training thing, I don't want to get into it right now, but like one of the things with micro learning, it always used to strike me quite funny, is people would be sort of pushing on the micro learning thing, sort of saying, people don't have the attention span, and so I'm going to be like, well, then they probably aren't going to have a very good time on board a ship on the bridge.
If you have to condense the learning into a 30-second
you need
TikTok
people
video,
who can concentrate. Unfortunately,
don't put that person on the bridge of a ship. I fully agree with you.
Well, but interesting. Let's move on, because I think we're talking about automation, and there was a story on your publication on Digital Ship that I saw, which I thought was interesting. So this was the MS Lumiere, the first dock-to-dock voyage, a turning point for inland shipping. We're a broad church here. We quite often talk deep sea, but inland shipping is important as well. So this was on the 24th of October, the MS Lumiere, first passenger vessel to autonomously undock, navigate and dock under real-world conditions in the, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, in the Netherlands. The thing that was interesting about the story, I know you're much more embedded in autonomous ships than I am. I don't, being someone who's kind of on the human side of shipping, I tend to
avoid it
and get quite irritated. any sort of automation of that nature. But what I liked about the way it talked about it was that it was a very human-centered version of autonomy. It talks very, very clearly in the article about the fact that the human is still very much in control, an experienced master on board the vessel. But the idea being, or the way they're pitching it, is that the master is then free to do more high-value things. Some of the stuff we talked about, some mentoring and all those kinds of things. And a less experienced master has that support of this system and everything to kind of take away some of the trickier bits. So something that they're looking at as very much kind of human in the loop, but sort of, assisted. So I think that was kind of interesting story.
In the inland shipping world across Benelux, there is something of a revolution going on, which is never really talked about in kind of deep sea in the deep sea universe, because we tend to keep it quite separate. But I've actually been to the remote operations center in Antwerp, where you walk into this big room and there are these kind of pods. There's 6 of these pods in the room, and in each pod is a master mariner, and they are just sat remotely driving the vessels. And they have some that are totally unmanned, and they have some that have a captain on board. Like in this instance, there's a captain on board, but the captain either wants to sleep or wants to do some admin work, or just needs to step away from the bridge, and the remote operator basically takes over control of the vessel. And that's been going on for years. I think I visited in 23, and it was up and running and had been for a couple of years at that point. But what's interesting to me about that story is and you said it was a first. It's the first time I've ever seen someone do kind of full dock-to-dock autonomously, which I thought was very, very interesting.
Yeah, we should call out the 3 companies. They'll like that, won't they?
Yeah.
3 companies made this possible: Shipping Technology, Retina, and Skylo, which is the vessel operator. So they also talk about this as a model of, our partnerships across different domains, hardware, software, and operations, to kind of make this change happen. So always good collaboration story as well within it too. So well done to them.
Did you see the news about the EverMax back in September, just to wind you up even more about autonomy?
I probably ignored it, to be honest.
So the EverMax, which is an evergreen container ship, crossed the Pacific autonomously back in September. Not dock to dock, it was full away on passage to end of sea passage. And 5,400 nautical mile voyage. The ship autonomously made 224 route adjustments for collision regulations and for weather routing during the voyage. And the humans on board, the officer of the watch, mate, master, they were all present and watchkeeping, but hands off, and they didn't touch the controls the entire time. And that is a 20-something thousand TEU container ship. People think of it as a future thing, but I can tell you, outside of Evergreen are Taiwanese, but the Japanese carriers, NYK, K-Line, and MOL, have all stated about 2 years ago, their strategy is manned autonomy. They want people on board, but they are struggling for lots of demographic reasons. They're struggling to recruit officers. And so the only way to make that work is that you're going to have a pool of fewer people, and so you need an autonomous system. So I think an unmanned bridge scenario being signed off by class is it's years and months away rather than years and decades away at this point. And it's being demonstrated by things like the EverMax.
What I'd really be interested in, I don't know whether you have the ability to kind of dig into it. I would love to know what the crew experience of that was, because one of my big concerns in this sort of scenario is that people like yourself who've been at sea often explain the importance of staying busy, things to do, right? Now obviously there's a whole bunch of maintenance things which will need to be done on the vessel that I assume are not being done autonomously. We're going to come to that in a minute. But are they just sat there? How long did you say that the whole voyage was in total?
5,400 miles. It's a Pacific crossing, so you're talking 3 to 4 weeks.
3 to 4 weeks of sort of not much to do. It would be an interesting thing to come out of that study as well, whether there was any sort of impact either way, positive or negative. So that's your task. That's your homework, Nick.
I will take that away and see what we can do. But I was speaking to the CIO of a container terminal yesterday, and he was telling me that one of the things that they've struggled with since they moved to remote cranes is that the crane operators no longer have like an instinctive feel for the crane. So like if the container gets stuck on something as they're lifting it up, if there's still a lashing attached or something like that, the operator will just pull harder. Because if you're sat in the crane, you'll feel the jolt that the container's stuck, and you'll stop and you'll investigate and you'll work it out. If the remote operations center is a few kilometers away, it's all done on a private 5G network, you can't feel that. For some reason it stops. So then you just pull harder on the controls. And I asked him about the kind of question around skill fade, and he said that's one of their biggest concerns is how when something goes wrong in that scenario, and for whatever reason the remote system is taken out, you have to then essentially send people up a crane again. And some of these people will not have done that physically, gone up a crane and sat in the sat at the actual physical controls for years at that point. And so it does create, I think there is a genuine risk there. How you counter that, I don't know. It probably, some combination of simulation and, other things that we've talked about today. But yeah, it is a problem.
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences leads us very nicely into another story, another digital ship story. So another congratulations.
God, you're an avid reader. Well, I'm enjoying this.
I mean, I have to say, it's getting back to like being the source, I think, for all good tech
subscribe
stories.
For free at thedigitalship.com.
Yeah. Talking of subscribing,
yeah,
please do like and subscribe. But no, this is coming to the rise of the robots. I'm calling this story. So this is a collab between Samsung Heavy Industries and Rainbow Robotics, and this is about shipyard automation. And basically, they've signed a partnership to develop and commercialize AI-powered robots for shipbuilding. And this is their part of automating critical processes like welding, painting, and inspection on vessels. They're looking, or certainly painting it as a way of kind of getting more consistency and more scalability, principally being that the robots don't get tired, right? So they can keep working long beyond shifts. And I started looking at what Rainbow Robotics do. They have a long track record in robotics, a lot of very humanoid robotics. They started out with something called Humi, which is very similar to that, perhaps that robot that people are more familiar with, that Japanese one whose name escapes me at the moment. Do you know what he's called? The Japanese one?
No.
Anyway,
I think I know the one you mean. The one, a very sweet little one.
Yeah, a little sweet one.
It was kind of useless.
This one looks a little bit less sweet. These are the mobile dual-armed robots and quadruped robots. Now, these, if you go on Rainbow Robotics, they talk about that as something that they're building towards in the future, but this is something that they have videos of and demonstrations of on the website at the moment. So when you talk about mobile dual arm, what you've really got there is a very interesting looking robot on wheels, but very mobile sort of upper body. So imagine a lower body pretty much taken account by sort of, imagine an upgrade on Davros or the Daleks or something like that, base with wheels. But the upper torso, let's call it, very fluid movement,
right.
2 arms, 2 kind of like pincers, but very capable of precision and elegant kind of movements. Okay, so it shows things like pouring a glass of water. And then the other ones, the quadrupeds, these are these sort of terrifying, they scare the hell out of me, but those dog ones, that can move around. Now, these are obviously going to be at work on a vessel. And you look at it and you start to think about this application in the shipyard, and it's not a big mental leap to start to think about, like, wouldn't it make total sense to start to bring these into the picture on board? There's some real potential benefit there to send in something like one of these robots into the double bottom tank in closed spaces, for example. If we could actually get a situation where they didn't have to do some of those more dangerous kind of operations, then that could be a big positive.
Yeah. So I lied earlier. My TikTok feed is ships, planes, and robots, and I have a bit of a weird obsession with humanoid robots. I'm just going to send you a link. Just click that link and just watch that video for a few seconds and just describe.
This is like a live unboxing. We haven't done one of these before.
Yeah.
Okay, wowzers.
So what Raal is looking at is a figure robot, and this has just been released. This is figure version 3. And basically the theory that figure is working towards is the world is optimized for human interaction. So if you're going to build robots, rather than build them with wheels like you were just talking about, just build really good humanoid robots. And build them with AI systems that are capable of learning. So everything you were just looking at, the clip I sent to Raal was a figure robot. If you Google figure 3,
we'll put the
doing
link.
The dishes. Yeah, let's put the link. Doing the dishes, packing groceries away, all of that sort of stuff. That's all been learned by watching a human do it, and then it trying to do it itself, and then it getting better and better and better. These robots don't get programmed in the same way that previous humanoid robots did. So they're kind of mind-blowing to me. And I think it is something that is going to come down the track in a big way. And it's just the way they're advancing is mind-blowing. Yeah. And these are the worst they'll ever be. Yeah.
It's very eerie because it's like watching a person who's had a massive drink and is trying to not to let on. It's sort of like, very
Yeah.
cautious kind of like, I'm just going to notice. I just get to the kitchen worktop. It's like, it's very spooky. Like, again, I think the thing, I can't take my eyes off it. I'm going to shut it down and look at it later. It's very, I mean, older than you, when we're now seeing things that were in comics when I was a kid,
Yeah. Yeah.
and as you know,
And that it's funny you mentioned that Japanese robot that was useless but very cute. It's like we're now getting to the point where the robots are neither cute nor useless.
yeah,
They're slightly threatening looking. And some of the stuff coming out of China, coming back to my TikTok feed, is like robots that can like physically fight. And there was a robot Olympics held a few weeks ago. I don't know whether you saw that, but they had robots doing all sorts of like human-based sports. And they were pretty terrible, but this is the worst they're ever going to be. They're only going to get better. The big kind of master plan for Figure, the company behind the robot you were just looking at, is $42 trillion, about 50% of global GDP is manual human labor. And that is what they see as their market opportunity, replacing the manual human labor.
Yeah. Yeah. Scary times. I mean, in terms of are we as a society, ready to keep up with what's technologically possible? And that thing that we talked about with the unintended consequences, I think is, the other thing, just to kind of, cheerful thought, watching something the other day that sort of talked about like super intelligence, the point at which the AI is, better than us, able to outthink us, is conservatively between 10 years, 20 years away.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what that looks like. We have no mechanism to manage that. The analogy or the very chilling comment that I took in my head, I can't remember who said it. One of the founders of AI or working with AI, he said that there is only one example in nature of a inferior being controlling a superior being, and that's a baby controlling its mother. In all other examples that you will find, the superior controls the inferior. So why do we think that super intelligence is going to, what's the role for us there, really?
I think as long as I didn't realize I was being controlled, I think I'm probably all right with that. As long as it does it in a way that I feel like I'm the boss, then I've got no problem with being looked after by an AI superlord.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the picture they're painting. I mean, like when you look at robots that have the full human range of movement that can fight. I also saw something this week, which was their ability to, through the use of cameras and Wi-Fi, AI, to be able to work out that afterwards it can drop the camera because it understands the relationship between the visual and the interruptions to the radio waves.
Wow.
To actually map where human beings are walking around in a space and visualize, so like, let's just assume the super intelligence kind of, if it were to, no, but I mean, in all seriousness, these are unstoppable. Like we talked about, like you'd put them in a shipyard because they never get tired. A robot army that is tireless knows exactly where you are, and it's something for us all to think about. So I mean,
as a way of rounding out the conversation, I can confidently say though that we're not there yet, because I've been sent. Shout out to Joe who sent me this article in Harvard Business Review. Joe, who's one of our listeners, got in touch with this article. Thought it might make for an interesting discussion on Undocked. AI generated work slop is destroying productivity. The MIT Media Lab did some research and found that 95% of organizations that have adopted AI show no measurable return on their investment in these technologies. And they've come up with a concept called work slop, which is AI generated work content that masquerades as good work but lacks the substance to meaningfully advance a given task. And as part of the survey they did, they surveyed over 1,000 US-based full-time employees. 40% of employees report having received some kind of work slop in the last month. So we're not there yet. We're not there yet. It's not yet better than us, in some instances at least.
No, I think that this is a really kind of, it's a good term, work slop. It's like things that have the simulacrum of good work, That's the problem. It looks like good work. So there's a real risk that a lot of stuff that looks kosher is actually irrelevant or
just
yeah,
genuinely bad. Based on the participants' estimates of time spent, as well as their self-reported salary, the researchers found that these work slop incidents carry an invisible tax of $186 per month, which is about what it costs to get ChatGPT Pro, which is ironic. So you're spending $200 on ChatGPT Pro, and then it's costing you $186 per month in work slop. So I think net, you're well down.
But like you said, you know, this is the important thing here. I think it's as bad as it's ever going to be. And you look at the way that what we've seen with every evolution of each GPT. So I think we have to take these things seriously. And coming back to it, I think there are a number of things that would be amazing if we could collectively organize on, in terms of really understanding what this is going to do in terms of the impact on our societies, the impact on, individuals, and how we can make sure that we have some control over something that will ultimately be more powerful than us. But unfortunately, what we're looking at the moment is a situation where no one is going to put the brakes on anywhere, because there's let's call it an arms race between different nations, between different companies, to just get to that destination point as quickly as possible. And that is really, really risky.
Yeah. It's very true.
And we have not got a good track record of being able to collectively organize for our own good. And the climate debacle that we kind of living through is just one really big example of that. We know what we need to do. We just cannot collectively organize to do it.
What a happy note to end on.
It is.
Now that you're all thoroughly depressed, you can go off.
If you like the dystopian vibe, please subscribe. For more,
wait for your AI overlord to tell you to subscribe.
No, but just to let's conclude on a happier note, because you mentioned there people writing in some really interesting debates being kicked off in the comments section around episodes that we're posting. I think we've seen a really good response to the guest conversations that we've had, and the audience for those just seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But people kind of getting involved and asking the right questions, coming forward with their own points of view as well is really great to see. So thank you for everybody that's taken the time to comment, to like, and to subscribe. Please keep it coming.
Yeah, we broke a record for us, which is that we crossed 1,000 streams over 30 days, which we were genuinely very, very pleased about. But when we looked into the analytics, it was the episodes that people were commenting on that did particularly well and seemed to then get shared in algorithms and stuff like that. So if you have enjoyed this, please drop a comment, because it genuinely makes a difference. So please keep on doing that. And if you can't be bothered to comment, then at least you could subscribe.
With that, I think we'll wrap up this week's show. So thank you all for listening. Good to see you, Nick.
Thank you all.
Have a safe journey home.
Good to see you. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.